Helen thought her fight with the HOA would be over when they slapped her with a $50,000 fine. But when they refused to back down, this mild-mannered suburban mom decided to take matters into her own hands and systematically engineer a hostile takeover of the entire HOA board. Now, with her future and her home on the line, Helen is about to learn just how far she'll go to protect what's rightfully hers. Helen stared at the letter in disbelief, her hands trembling as she gripped the thick stack of papers. A $50,000 fine for a small pothole in her driveway that she'd been meaning to fix. This has to be a mistake, she muttered, scanning the fine print again. But the details were clear. If she didn't pay the exorbitant penalty within 30 days, the HOA would place a lion on her home. After 15 years of mortgage payments, she couldn't risk losing it all. Helen slumped back in her chair, her mind racing. Where would she even get that kind of money? She thought of her meager savings, the college funds for the kids, even dipping into her retirement. But it still wouldn't be enough. No, this isn't happening, she whispered, clenching her fists. I won't let them do this. Determined, Helen marched out to her car and headed straight for the HOA office. The smug smile on Linda's face as she opened the door only fueled Helen's rage. What is the meaning of this? Helen demanded, slamming the fine letter on the desk. You can't seriously expect me to pay $50,000 for a tiny pothole. Linda leaned back in her chair, examining her nails with feigned disinterest. It's in the bylaws, Helen. You fail to maintain your property, so the fine is more than reasonable. Reasonable? Helen scoffed. This is extortion. I'm on a fixed income, for God's sake. There's no way I can pay this. Well, that's not our problem, Linda replied coolly. You have 30 days to pay up, or we'll foreclose on your home. I'd start looking for a new place to live if I were you. Helen's vision blurred with tears of frustration. You can't do this. I won't let you. Linda smirked. Oh, but we can. And we will. Unless, of course, you want to volunteer for the HOA board. Then maybe we can work something out. Helen froze, her mind racing. The HOA board? An idea began to form, fueled by a burning desire for justice and a resolve she didn't know she possessed. All right, Linda, she said, straightening her spine. Where do I sign up? Helen spent the next 2 weeks studying the HOA bylaws, mapping out every rule and regulation. She attended every board meeting, observing the other members with a keen eye. Linda and her cronies thought they were dealing with a mild-mannered pushover, but Helen was about to show them just how wrong they were. When the annual HOA elections rolled around, Helen threw her hat in the ring, running on a platform of reform and accountability. At first, the other board members dismissed her as a nuisance, certain their usual tactics of intimidation and vote rigging would easily secure their re-election. But Helen had a plan. She went door to door, introducing herself to every homeowner and listening to their grievances. She organized town halls, giving residents a voice they'd long been denied. Slowly but surely, a groundswell of support began to build. On election day, Helen and her slate of reform-minded candidates swept the board, ousting the old guard in a decisive victory. As Linda and the others watched in stunned silence, Helen took the podium, a triumphant grin on her face. Thank you all for putting your trust in us, she began, her voice filled with steel. For too long, this HOA has operated like a private fiefdom, trampling on the rights of homeowners and lining the pockets of a select few. That ends today. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Helen raised her hand for silence. From this moment on, the $50,000 fine against me is hereby rescinded, and we will be conducting a full audit of the HOA's finances to uncover any other instances of corruption or abuse of power. Linda shot up from her seat, her face flushed with rage. You can't do this. That fine was perfectly legitimate. Helen fixed her with a cold stare. Oh, but I can. And I will. The era of the HOA strongman is over. Welcome to the new era of homeowner democracy. As the crowd roared its approval, Helen knew this was only the beginning. She had won the battle, but the war against the corrupt HOA was just getting started. Over the next few weeks, Helen and her reform-minded board members set to work dismantling the HOA's web of corruption. They launched a forensic audit of the organization's finances, uncovering a trove of questionable expenses, sweetheart deals, and suspicious campaign contributions that lined the pockets of the former board. Meanwhile, Helen continued to meet with homeowners, listening to their concerns and building a coalition of support. She knew that lasting change would require not just a shakeup of the board, but a fundamental shift in the HOA's priorities and power structure. "These people have been running roughshod over us for years," Helen told the residents at a town hall meeting. "But no more. We're taking back control of our community, and we're going to do it the right way." The response was overwhelming. Homeowners who had long felt powerless against the HOA's heavy-handed tactics now saw a path to reclaiming their rights. They volunteered their time, donated money to the reform effort, and showed up in droves to the monthly board meetings. Linda and the other former board members, meanwhile, were not taking their defeat lying down. They launched a relentless campaign of harassment and intimidation, flooding Helen's inbox with threats and complaints. They even tried to rally a group of loyalists to attend the board meetings and shout her down. But Helen was undaunted. She had faced down the HOA's tactics before, and she was determined to see this fight through to the end. "They can't bully us anymore," she told her fellow board members. "We have the power now, and we're going to use it to make this community better for everyone." As the reform effort gained momentum, Helen began to uncover even deeper layers of wrongdoing within the HOA. Kickbacks, self-dealing, and outright theft were uncovered, leading to the arrest of several former board members. The noose was tightening around Linda and her cronies, and they knew it. They tried desperately to regain control, but Helen and her team were one step ahead at every turn. Finally, in a last-ditch effort, Linda and her allies filed a lawsuit, seeking to have the election results overturned. But as Helen stood before the judge, armed with mountains of evidence and the unwavering support of the community, she knew she had them cornered. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The election stood, and the HOA reform movement was here to stay. As the news of the judge's ruling spread through the community, a collective sigh of relief and celebration could be heard. The homeowners who had long suffered under the HOA's heavy-handed rule now saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim the neighborhood they loved. Helen stood at the center of it all, a quiet sense of triumph washing over her. She had faced down the corruption and intimidation tactics of the old guard, and she had emerged victorious. But she knew the hard work was just beginning. "This is a new chapter for our community," Helen told the gathered residents at a victory rally. "We've shown that when we stand together, we can overcome even the most entrenched powers. But now, the real work begins." She laid out her vision for the future, a community-focused HOA that would prioritize the needs and concerns of homeowners over the narrow interests of a few. She promised to conduct a thorough review of the HOA's bylaws, to streamline the architectural approval process, and to invest in much-needed infrastructure improvements. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Helen could see the hope and relief in their faces. For so long, they had felt powerless, but now they had a champion, someone who was willing to fight for their rights and their shared vision for the neighborhood. As Helen descended from the stage, she was immediately surrounded by a throng of well-wishers, all eager to shake her hand and express their gratitude. Among them was Linda, her face twisted in a mask of barely contained fury. "This isn't over, Helen," she spat, her eyes narrowed. "You may have won this battle, but the war is just beginning." Helen met her gaze unflinchingly. "Bring it on, Linda. I'm not going anywhere." With that, she turned and made her way through the crowd, a renewed sense of purpose fueling her every step. She knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was more than ready for the challenge. After all, she had the community on her side, and that was worth more than any amount of money or power that the old HOA regime could muster. In the aftermath of her victory, Helen quickly learned that taking control of the HOA was only the first step in a long and arduous battle. As she and her fellow board members delved deeper into the organization's affairs, they uncovered a morass of corruption, mismanagement, and blatant disregard for the needs of the community. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off into the pockets of the former board members, while essential repairs and upgrades had been neglected for years. Homeowners were routinely fined for minor infractions, with the penalties going directly into the HOA's coffers rather than being reinvested in the community. It's been a complete and utter mess, Helen lamented to her husband, Jack, over dinner one evening. I had no idea just how deeply the rot had set in. Jack reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I know it's overwhelming, honey, but you're doing the right thing. This community needs someone like you to fight for them. Helen sighed, her gaze drifting to the window, where the sun was just beginning to set. I just hope I'm up to the task. There's so much work to be done, and we're constantly being stonewalled by the old guard. Indeed, Linda and her allies had not gone quietly into the night. They continued to launch legal challenges, flood the HOA's offices with complaints, and even go so far as to vandalize the homes of Helen's reform-minded allies. They're not going to give up without a fight, Helen told the board at their next meeting. We need to be prepared for anything. They'll stop at nothing to regain control. The other board members nodded grimly, their faces set with determination. We're with you, Helen, one of them said. We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we're in it for the long haul. Helen felt a surge of gratitude and pride. These were her neighbors, her friends, her community, and they were all in this together. With their support, she knew they could weather any storm that the old regime could throw at them. All right, then, she said, straightening her spine. Let's get to work. Over the next few months, Helen and her team worked tirelessly to untangle the HOA's web of corruption. They commissioned forensic audits, filed whistleblower reports, and even turned over evidence of criminal wrongdoing to the authorities. And slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak up now found their voices, rallying behind Helen's cause. The old guard's influence began to wane, and the community's trust in the HOA began to be restored. It was a long and arduous battle, but Helen knew that every step forward was a victory, not just for her, but for the entire neighborhood. As Helen and her reform-minded board continued to unravel the HOA's web of corruption, they began to uncover even more startling revelations. It seemed that the former board members had been using the HOA's resources for their own personal gain, siphoning off funds to finance lavish lifestyles and pet projects. It's like something out of a bad movie, Helen told Jack, her eyes wide with disbelief. They were using our money to buy vacation homes, throw parties, and even sponsor their own political campaigns. Jack whistled low, shaking his head in disgust. I always knew those people were crooked, but this is next-level stuff. Helen nodded, her jaw set with determination. Well, we're about to blow the lid off the whole thing. I've got my team working around the clock to gather all the evidence we need. True to her word, Helen and her fellow board members sprang into action, meticulously documenting every shred of financial malfeasance they could find. They pored over bank statements, invoices, and receipts, piecing together a damning picture of the former board's misdeeds. Meanwhile, the old guard continued to fight back, launching a relentless campaign of harassment and intimidation. Homeowners who dared to support the reform effort found their homes vandalized, their pets threatened, and their families harassed. But Helen and her team refused to be cowed. They stepped up security measures, enlisted the help of the local police, and refused to back down in the face of the old regime's tactics. We're not going to let them bully us, Helen declared at a town hall meeting. We're going to expose their corruption for the whole world to see, and we're not going to stop until justice is served. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Helen felt a surge of pride and determination. This was her community, and she was going to fight for it with every fiber of her being. As the investigation continued to unfold, the scope of the former board's misdeeds became increasingly clear. Luxury vacations, lavish parties, and even outright theft. It was all there, documented in meticulous detail. Finally, with the evidence in hand, Helen and her team took their findings to the authorities. The former board members were swiftly arrested and charged with a litany of crimes, from fraud and embezzlement to racketeering and money laundering. As the news of the arrests spread through the community, a collective sigh of relief and vindication could be heard. The reign of the corrupt HOA regime was finally over, and a new era of transparency and accountability was about to begin. With the former HOA board members facing criminal charges, Helen and her team turned their attention to the crucial task of rebuilding the community's trust and restoring its financial health. It was a daunting challenge, but they were determined to do whatever it took to make things right. First, they conducted a comprehensive audit of the HOA's finances, working closely with forensic accountants to trace every dollar that had been misappropriated or misused. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off into the personal accounts of the former board members, while essential repairs and upgrades had been woefully neglected. It's going to take years to undo the damage they've done, Helen told the community at a town hall meeting, her voice laced with a mix of anger and determination. But we're not going to let them get away with it. Every penny they stole will be recovered, and every penny will be reinvested in our neighborhood. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, and Helen knew that she had the full support of the community behind her. This was their fight, too, a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the future of their shared home. As the legal proceedings against the former board members dragged on, Helen and her team worked tirelessly to implement a series of sweeping reforms. They streamlined the architectural approval process, made the HOA's finances more transparent, and invested heavily in much-needed infrastructure improvements. The changes were not always easy, and there were plenty of battles to be fought along the way. But Helen remained steadfast, her resolve strengthened by the knowledge that she was fighting for something greater than herself. "This is about more than just getting our money back," she told her fellow board members. "It's about restoring the sense of community that we've all lost. It's about making this a place where people are proud to call home." Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Homeowners who had once been distrustful and cynical now found themselves reconnecting with their neighbors, participating in community events, and taking pride in the upkeep of their shared spaces. And as the former board members were convicted and sentenced, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Justice had been served, and the HOA was now firmly in the hands of those who had the best interests of the neighborhood at heart. For Helen, it was a bittersweet victory. The road had been long and arduous, and the cost had been high. But as she looked out over the revitalized community, she knew that it had all been worth it. As the dust settled and the community began to heal, Helen found herself the reluctant hero of a story that had captivated the nation. News of her improbable victory over the corrupt HOA regime had spread far and wide, and she was now being hailed as a symbol of grassroots activism and the power of ordinary citizens to effect change. Requests for interviews and speaking engagements poured in from all corners, and Helen found herself torn between her desire for privacy and her sense of obligation to the broader movement she had helped inspire. "I never wanted to be the center of attention," she confessed to Jack one evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. "I just wanted to make things right for our community." Jack squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with admiration. "And that's exactly what you did, Helen. You fought for what was right, and you won. That's something to be proud of." Helen sighed, her gaze drifting to the meticulously maintained homes and lush landscaping that surrounded them. "I just hope the changes we've made will last. I don't want all of this to be for nothing." "It won't be," Jack assured her. "You've shown this community that they have a voice, and that they can stand up to corruption. That's a legacy that will endure long after you're gone." Helen nodded, feeling a newfound sense of purpose and resolve. She knew that the work was far from over, that the fight for transparency and accountability in homeowners associations would continue long after she stepped down from the board. But as she looked out over the neighborhood she loved, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. This was her home, her community, and she had fought to protect it with everything she had. And in the end, that was all that mattered.